Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We know it'll take a few seconds for everyone to connect, so just hold on. We'll start in the next 30 seconds or so. Thanks for joining us today, and just stay on the line, please. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are just watching the participants. We are seeing the numbers go up as people are joining. Just give us a few more seconds as people connect, and we will go ahead and start the webinar. Hello, everyone. We were waiting for people to connect, but we will go ahead and start the webinar as people are logging on. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We have a few housekeeping items before we start today's program. I'm Andrea Jensen. I'm the Education Specialist for Allergy and Asthma Network. All participants will be on mute for the webinar. We will record today's webinar, and this will be posted on our website within a few days. You can find this and any of our recorded webinars on our website at allergyasthmanetwork.org. Scroll to the bottom of the page to find our recorded webinars and any upcoming webinars. The webinar will be about an hour, and we will have time for questions, and it might go a little bit shorter depending on questions. We will take those questions at the end of the webinar, but if you have a burning question, you can put it in right now in the Q&A on the bottom left-hand side of your screen at any time. We have someone monitoring the chat if you have questions or need help, and we will get to as many questions as we can before we conclude today's webinar. We do not offer CEUs for this particular webinar, but you will receive an email a few days after the webinar. We will have resources about climate cycles and a link to download your certificate of attendance. Today, we'll discuss how a major shift in climate cycles will bring a very wet pattern to the U.S. through 2023, which can help to reduce allergy and asthma suffering. But by the fall and winter, it will likely be the coldest in a decade, exacerbating folks who suffer from the cold and dry weather asthma triggers. Allergy and Asthma Network is a grassroots organization that was started over 35 years ago by a mom who knew that other mothers like her needed resources and support. Our mission is to end the needless death and suffering due to allergies, asthma, and related conditions through outreach, education, advocacy, and research. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Captain Bill Kirk. Bill Kirk is CEO and founder of Weather Trends International, which offers highly accurate and proprietary year-ahead weather forecasting with predictive seasonal category sales analytics for Fortune 500 companies. Weather Trends uses a statistical modeling algorithm fueled by 125 plus years of weather data and 24 climate cycles that cover every square mile of the Earth, rather than physics-based meteorology. Weather Trends year-ahead forecast is typically 80 to 87% accurate, with less error than the weather industry week's 2-week short-range forecast. The year-ahead forecast also outperforms NOAA's month-ahead forecast 85% of the time on temperatures and 86% for precipitation over the last 15 years. Bill received a bachelor's degree in meteorology and physics from Rutgers University and received the Air Force Distinguished Graduate Award from New Jersey Governor Tom Keene before entering the United States Air Force. Bill held a top secret SCI security clearance and received awards for his support in the Gulf War Desert Storm. While in the U.S. Air Force, Bill was involved with NASA's Space Shuttle Columbia operation Just Cause in Panama, the British Royal Knighting of General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, or as we all probably remember him, Stormin' Norman, and the procurement of a 100 million satellite handling data system. He is therefore the real Captain Kirk. Let there be no mistake. Bill has been featured on national TV networks, including Fox Business, Fox Weather, CNBC, and ABC 2020. He's an inventor and co-inventor of 3 US and UK patents and has published research in hundreds of Wall Street equity reports. Under Bill's leadership, Weather Trends has received 17 national and international business technology awards, including Forbes magazine's 5th most promising company in America. Bill is ranked 17th on Owler's CEO list out of 167,000 CEOs in 2017. Bill and Weather Trends are committed to doing business with a greater purpose. Weather Trends uses the term business as mission to describe the company's commitment to partnering with community organization. Bill understands that he and his company have been blessed, and therefore he wants Weather Trends to be a blessing to not only their clients, but the communities they serve. Thank you for being with us today, Captain Kirk. We're lucky to have you as we discuss climate cycles and changes and how they can impact allergies and asthma.
Well, Andrea and Chris, thank you. We have a lot to live up with all that you talk about. I don't think we've gotten there yet. I know Andrea's got probably 800 inches of snow in her Utah mountains, and Chris is headed for tornadoes in Tennessee. So we're not going to go warp speed 10 today. I don't want anybody to break or computers to fail. So we'll do warp speed 5. I will go probably about 20, 25 minutes with some slides, and then hopefully leave plenty of time for some good questions here. So, and the real Captain Kirk, I joke that imposter on TV is the guy that got me all jazzed about science as a kid in Hawaii. Some 35 years ago, met this, at the time, I said I knew him before he was famous, Mr. General Storm Norman Schwarzkopf. Changed how I think as a scientist. So I came out of Rutgers, physics, meteorology, fluid dynamics. I said, give me an answer and don't change your mind once you give me an answer. I'm like, okay, let's dump Rutgers and physics because we got to think differently, and that's statistics and climate cycles. So that's what we do today. Apologize, you can't see, where technical difficulties showing my face in our studio here, but we're in a pretty cool, we call it the spaceship here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So again, cool office here. We've been in the allergy space for at least 22 years. We work part of SDI, which is Equivia, so predicting allergy. The way we back into allergy was that we looked at point of sale data that you buy for your allergy medication over the counter, right? And what we found correlations were the obvious. When it's warm and dry in the spring, pollen is naturally there all the time. Pollen's always there. So it's not a question of whether you're going to have pollen. It's a question of how long does it stay in the air? So what washes it out? Rain, snow, wind. Colder weather is not necessarily favorable. So if it's warm and dry, all that pollen is suspended in the air, whether it's tree, grass, weeds, doesn't really matter. That'll make you exposed to it and you will have more suffering. So that's how we're able to today project, allergy sales in theory, because we know when you're going to go in and do what you're doing. In fact, we predicting you're going to go do it here probably next week. So if you haven't had your allergy suffering yet, it's about to get real here next week. So work with pollen.com even today. Sanofi, if some of these clients are more in the flu space, Johnson & Johnson, Bayer for their allergy products, again, Equivia. So again, a lot of, and obviously very blessed to work with you guys, Allergy and Asthma Network. So we're humanitarian in our focus and like to, help people rather than big corporations, which unfortunately we do, or fortunately, how we look at it. So I thought we'd start here with just a quick physics list. This will be very fast, but again, people kind of like this stuff. So meteorology physics 101 is just simple. If this was just one drop, one storm in the ocean, that would be easy physics, easy fluid dynamics. Rutgers, we had to dissect that equation and it was painful, just this drop. The reality in meteorology, though, is you have millions and millions of interactions. There's actually trillions of interactions of storms and even thunderstorm outflow boundaries and hurricanes, tornadoes. All of that is changing the environment around us everywhere in the world. One big hurricane changes the whole world for potentially weeks, right? And not only do you have to worry about the surface physics, you have to worry about all the way up to 80,000 feet. So it's crazy math. And unfortunately, that's what Physics Meteorology 101 tries to do. And that's why your forecast is constantly changing, right? 2, 3, 4 days every day. It's changing. Oh, the weekend's great. Oh, the weekend's lousy. Oh, the weekend's pretty good, right? There's new physics. There's new data every day, 4 times a day. Models will rerun. It's chaos, right? This is good for a week or 2 at the very best. It's not how you can do year ahead. So after the famous walk I had with General Schwarzkopf, we really dove in. I had about 40 meteorologists at MacDill Air Force Base. And we started thinking, how can we do year ahead weather? How can we do long-term weather, statistics, climate cycles, right? So I give this easy example here locally, here in Bethlehem, Northeast. If it's a 1 standard deviation, it's a really hot March, what happens the next year, right? You go back, you look at 150 plus years of data. Wow, guess what? There's a 94% chance it's snowy the next March and an 86% chance it's really cold. those are pretty strong odds, 86 to 94% chance. Now we do these statistics by day, by mile, for 32 million locations. So it's trillions upon trillions upon trillions of calculations to do a worldwide, year ahead forecast. So the other thing we'll look at is something that big. Now these are climate cycles that you've heard of some of them. La Nina, we've been in a 3-year La Nina cycle. We'll talk about how that's completely collapsing. We've been in a pattern here of, we'll talk about it in just a minute, but that's only happened twice in 157 years. So if you think your weather's weird, you can blame it on these cycles, because we're about, again, 2 out of the last 157 years where we've been in a pattern like this. So I won't give away the trade secret algorithm here of what we do, but if you ever seen a wave slosh, apologize, this is not animating here, but if you ever seen a wave cycle slosh, kind of like a sine curve, we just call our process as kind of a sloppy sine curve. It's got high amplitude periods and low amplitude periods. And we use that kind of math, if you will, to project the weather a year ahead. So the next thing is, if you can get the weather right, and we'll show you some accuracy here in a second, but if you get the weather right, short-term year ahead, you can then also predict outcomes. So our technology has, I think we're up well over 10,000 seasonal categories of everything you buy, whether it's allergy medication, asthma medications, you name it, we probably have analyzed it, why you buy what you buy. So allergy medications don't have a strong correlation to weather, but not a huge up and down. So every degree hotter in the spring, there's about a 1% move in allergy medication. So if it's 20 degrees hotter, you have a 20% increase in allergy sales. That's a pretty sizable move for this category. Now, things like an air conditioner, every degree hotter in spring and summer can be a 15% move. So if it's 20 degrees hotter, 100, it's 300% gains in heater sales or air conditioner sales. So there's a downside here. Obviously, if it's colder and wetter, you're going to have suppressed allergy medication sales. Again, we've seen that with every single, you name it, allergy, and asthma. We've analyzed those sales. So what we show is not a TV forecast, right? This is not what you'd expect to see. So this is a year ahead sales forecast. We do this for millions of retail geographies, for Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, wherever you buy a product. We predict their sales down to their store, their DC, their warehouses. So this allows them to be proactive. And again, that's a word we like to use with them, and a word we'd like to use with us that suffer. I've had asthma in the past, and allergies kind of come and go. Andrew was telling me why maybe my allergies go away for a while, but that doesn't mean that I can't have a flare up 5 years from now, 2 years from now, or next week, right? So just because I may be in the doldrums of not having those severe ailments, again, very important, as I'm sure you've heard them say a million times, right? Keep on top of your medication. Don't think you're good because I didn't have allergy last year. Well, last year maybe in cold and rain, right? So now this is we won't get into the regression analysis here, but basically just proving the obvious that when you're warmer and drier, there's a higher incidence of asthma and allergy sales, and when you're colder and wetter, there's a lower incidence of allergy sales. Right, so that correlation is about 72%. R squared is about 72%. So there's a pretty strong cause and effect relationship between, again, makes sense to us, right? Pollen, if it's washed out constantly with rain, like we're having this year in a lot of areas, you're just not going to be exposed to as much pollen, right? Versus if it's hot and dry for 3 straight weeks, that pollen's stuck in the air forever. You're going to be suffering immensely. So the other thing we did is we just cross-correlated allergy and asthma prescriptions. So we have patient-level data at a 3-level zip all across the country for, forget how many years of data that was, 10 plus years of data. And you found a very strong correlation. Between allergy and asthma sales, there's about a 95% correlation, meaning the people that suffer from allergy, if you're inclined to suffer from asthma, you both are suffering at the same time. And God forbid you suffer from allergies and asthma, then obviously you really are compounded with the impact of weather. The next thing we do is this flu. Flu is more viral. It has nothing really to do with pollen, but it's actually a predictable weather event. So chart left, busy chart here, but chart left is the CDC's flu trend. So obviously, if you were paying attention here this past year, we had a very, very fast start to the flu season, something we haven't seen since 2009, 13 years ago. And what happened here, if you look at the chart right, is that we had the coldest conditions in the Southeast, August, September, front half of October, in over 21 years. It was just a frigid, epic start to the really cold weather in the Southeast. What also happened is it got very dry. And as you get very cold and dry, what do you do? 2 things. First thing you're gonna do is you're gonna turn your heat on in your house. That's kind of the death sentence of you're gonna get very low humidity in your home. So even if outside has 30–40% humidity in the fall, you turn on your heat in your house, your humidity in your house can be, our offices here, for example, got down to 8%. That's non-existent moisture in your home. What a Harvard study proved with some mice many years ago was that, and I think it was a recent study as well, that when it's cold and dry for sure outside, low humidity, that flu virus, COVID virus, or really any virus, even pollen, right, maintains its structure, right? So COVID and flu tend to have these spiky proteins, I guess, on the, I'm not a doctor in that regard, but it has these little spikes obviously on it. And if you're in a dry, cold environment, they just maintain their shape, right? And they're much more than susceptible to be able to plant themselves in your nose, your throat, your eyes, your mucous membranes, right? So, but versely, if it's hot and humid, those viruses swell. And if they swell, they lose their little spikes a little bit. They're just more like a basketball. They're going to bounce off of you. They may not be able to attach to you and make you sick as easily. So what happens in the South when you get flu always starts in the Southeast. We're not entirely sure. It's a demographic issue. Maybe less access to healthcare in the South. Mississippi, Alabama, New Orleans is kind of where it starts. Don't entirely know why. You know why it tends to always start in that area. It starts, but it can get kids go back to school very early in the South. So part of that's, you get the cold weather, your nose dries out, or it gets cold, you tend to get back. There was just a study we just saw somewhere recently where a cold nose is kind of a very bad thing, right? That's one thing that can lead to you getting sick pretty quickly, not because your nose is cold, but just because of the way the virus can spread more easily in your virus. 2021, again, the season was much later. So we had a peak this year in October, November timeframe. And then as you can see, it just tailed off during the normally we were talking about flu in December, January, more like January, February. That wasn't the case this year. So it really trailed off. So goes the weather, so goes flu to an extent. Now, if we're going to talk anything here in a minute about our year ahead forecast, we don't hide behind accuracy. So we're always showing this is our year ahead forecast, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, right here where we are. So we're down to the city. We do this for 32 million spots, verifying what we do. The bars are a year ahead forecast. It's a rolling year ahead forecast. So every week that you're seeing on here was something that was made a year prior. So blues are cold, reds are hot, dotted line is actual. We're never going to be perfect, but typically, as Andrea said, we're typically in that 80 to 87% range. Just on the, I said it hot, it was hot. I said it was cold, wet, it was wet, dry, it was dry. The more important piece here is that the error within these forecasts is less than a week 2 physics-based forecast. In a lot of cases where people live, 80% of the populations live near oceans, we're actually better than a day 2 forecast, even though it's a year ahead. So there's a lot of validity to statistical climate cycle-based approach to predicting things a year ahead. She talked briefly about NOAA. This orange line, NOAA is going to get, NOAA on March 31st issued their April forecast. So one day before the month is going to happen, they issue their April forecast. That's the orange line. The blue line is our year ahead forecast for April. So even though we're a year in advance of NOAA, we're outperforming them about 85% of the time over the last 15, 16 years. So again, anything above that 0 line is considered skill. This is using their 1,340 some cities. It's using their high key skill score methodology. It's apples to apples. The only thing that's different is that we're using what we said a year ago versus what they say a day before the month. So precip, same thing. We're really good, about 86% on outperforming NOAA. So again, it just speaks to the fact that if you want to try to predict an outcome, which is what we like to do, I don't want to just tell you the weather. I want to predict something. I want to tell you how bad the allergy season is going to be here in the next 2 weeks. Really bad, right? So we want to get the weather right and get these outcome rights. So let's start talking about how this climate cycle shift, right? So if you look at the equatorial Pacific, where I don't know if you'll see my mouse here. I don't want to do anything to mess up the screen here, but where you see El Nino forming, the equatorial Pacific is very important. In fact, all the oceans are very important in terms of predicting our weather, right? So what happens in the oceans will ultimately have an impact downstream. What's happened recently, the last 3 years, is the Pacific, the North Pacific, it's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and the equatorial Pacific, from all the way from Australia toward Peru, that area has been cold. It's actually been very cold. In fact, the North Pacific had been the second coldest in history, 168 years ago. So because it had been so cold, you had a La Nina, which just means the water's cold in the equatorial regions. What that tends to do, if you're in that area, which the United States was and Brazil was, you get drought. Drought became epic across the US up until this year. So the last few years. That is completely flip-flop, because so now if you look at that El Nino forming, that all used to be blue this time last year, and now it's all greens, yellows, and reds, meaning above average, much warmer water temperatures in that area. The other thing we're looking at is you look at toward the Indian Ocean, right? You see it's getting colder there, right? So now it's shifting. It's a whole pattern of drought in the Americas. Now drought's kind of bad, right? If you've got drought in America, that means we're probably hot, we're probably dry. It means the pollen's in the air. It means you probably suffered a little bit, through those drier periods, right? Pollen's in the air more quickly. But we see the cold water shifting toward the Indian Ocean. And what that means is already seeing the weather kind of respond in China. China's getting very dry. They've had 3 pretty wet years. We were dry, they were wet, and now they're drying out. India, drying out. Right? So the whole climate pattern is shifting with the cycles happening in the oceans. We just look at some of the data here. This is USDA's drought data. We peaked at back on November 1st, 82% of the country was dry or drought. I've never seen it that high. And again, classic La Nina. Now, right now, as of here recently at the end of March, we're down about 52%. Average of this time of year, we have about 48% of the country dry, but we're making huge improvements over what we've been in. And we're forecasting that we're going to get down to about 25 to 35% of the country in drought phases. California's drought, while it still shows it up a little bit, it's over. I mean, it's Utah, it's over, right? I mean, the snow melts, you've got plenty of moisture from the winter season here. So in theory, the drought is getting vaporized here all across the West. Plains, Kansas still has some. They're Texas, obviously, but that may improve as well as we go through this year. So again, we look at some of the response here. What are we seeing? So this is just wildfires. Wildfires are important because obviously they can burn up stuff. It just exacerbates your allergies and your asthma. So wildfires are always kind of a critical component. But what we see right now is it's just kind of off the scale. It's early, but as of 1 April, we're 78% below average here in 2023 in terms of wildfire acres burned across the country. Not a lot of stuff burning out there because we've been so wet and so snowy across the West. So that's some good news. Now, 2017, we started off with just off the scale. 2017 was a really bad wildfire season. So you may go back and look, 2017 was a really bad allergy asthma season for me as well. We're not there. That's not the case of what we're seeing here right now. So right now, our forecast is projecting that by the whole year is over for 2023, we would suspect that wildfires are down about 20% below average. Nothing like, say, 2020, which was pretty bad wildfire season, 2017. So if you look at the drought years of 2020, 2021, 2022, we were slightly, what happens though, after a big burn year like 2020, there's just not much underbrush left to burn, right? So if you have a really bad year like 2017, you just don't have a bad, even though 2018 may have been dry, there's nothing left to burn, right? So again, California rainfall is up 916% versus a year ago, 92% above average, wettest in 6 years, third wettest in their history almost. So a lot of rain obviously is going to suppress that. Now there will be some growth this year in terms of underbrush. It'll be very green in California to start this year once the snow melts. That will burn. So grass fires may be a little common this year, but the big, huge timber fires, because these trees will be so latently full of moisture, you're not going to have the big, huge forest fires really this year. So because of the ample moisture in the trees. I know Chris is maybe he get a bolt here at some point because of the tornado warnings or watches in her area in Tennessee. We actually projected, because of the shift in La Nina, we're getting in, obviously we were projecting very frequent cold fronts here, and that leads to a lot of tornadoes, right? You clash cold this time of year with the warm southeast weather, right? Cold and warm, you're going to get tornadoes in the middle. So we had projected to be the worst in 4 years. Right now, we're off to the fastest start in 6 years, and we're in the top 3% of recorded tornadic activity history, which goes back to the mid-1950s. Tornado data doesn't go back as far. So it's a very active season. I only bring this up, again, these are not predictable events other than just high level to say this is going to be the worst season in 4 years. It only takes one to hit a city to obviously make that very impactful. But it just speaks to that if we've got another really high risk, like Chris is thinking about it right now. So Chris is an asthma sufferer and she has to go to the drugstore tonight to get her medication. Yikes. right? You know, who knows about the drugstore? Who knows about our home, right? There could be chaos here. Not, there won't be for Chris, but right, you have to keep on top of that and make sure you have it ready. It's just don't be surprised because these climatic events, like you won't be able to do things. Maybe hurricanes for sure. So hurricanes, we're actually projecting here another, unfortunately, active season year. We're projecting at least 15 named storms. That's a little bit more than last year's 14. It only takes one. Hurricane Ian actually decimated Florida, one of the biggest, 57 billion plus in damages, 337 people killed. My aunt lives in the Fort Myers area, and again, they had to go 3 hours just to get ice to medicate for their medication. That had to stay cold, right? They were without power for a month. Right, so just these are the things that happen, and Ian was a classic example of how you need to be so prepared, even if you're not in the direct path. Ian was going to hit the panhandle of Florida 2 days in advance, and then the day after it was going to hit Tampa, and then hours later it moved 400 miles to the south, all the way to Fort Myers. So the shift in those tracks can be very fast, and you're like, oh, we were safe in Fort Myers 48 hours ago, 24 hours ago, and then they got decimated. So always important to keep on track. Unfortunately, Florida. We're even worried about Texas this year. So Texas, Florida, East Coast might be our top spots for hurricane activity. Busy chart here, so let me explain it here. So these bars are kind of the year ahead weather. We're actually going to show this benchmark versus last year. You can argue in some areas, like Phoenix, it's hotter than average every year, right? So telling you the trends versus average may not give you a lot of intelligence to your suffering potential. Whereas what we're showing you here is the trends. This is a national view, how they're different than last year. So we've had obviously the epically cold Christmas, in fact, parts in the East here, a lot of the country, it was the second coldest mid-December Christmas period there in 125 years. It was just off the scale cold in Christmas. And then it flipped. January, again, some of the warmest weather in decades, February the same. And then late March, it flipped again, where it got much, much colder. So the red bars are where we say it's going to be much hotter than last year. Blue bars colder than last year. Peach bars are drier. Chart bottom left is peach or drier weeks. And the greens are much wetter weeks. So what you see here is, if I showed you this chart last year, you would have had a lot of really dry weeks for 3 years in a row. So we would have had a lot of dry weeks there. And we have some of that right now here in spring, but the pattern's collapsing. You're seeing it in the West. It's starting to materialize, in the central and eastern part of the US. So let's just dive in here. So if we look at, spring, April, May timeframe, we have the warmest in 11 years, drier than last year. So if we're going to pick out some really bad periods for allergy, we're going to pick the next 2 weeks, unfortunately. I think it's going to be, you're going to have 80s near 90-degree weather next week in the central US, off the scale, second hottest in at least 38 years, maybe 125 years. So extremely hot, dry, brief period here in mid-April. Now dry is relative, right? Doesn't mean you're not going to get rain, but just there's this pollen suspension in the air will be high. So if you suffer, and this is kind of a nationwide event, I mean, the whole country looks to get very warm next week and the third week of April. So this is going to be the peak for sure of the allergy and asthma suffering for the spring season here. Grass trees for sure. So we have those areas as high. The next high period for probably more for grass is going to be that warmer, drier week in late May, going into the Memorial Day weekend. And then the next period for grass is probably going to be the week. These are week ending dates, so probably the 3rd through the 10th of June is probably the last of the maybe severe allergy suffering. Then you see kind of a colder, wetter trend kind of going through the rest of the year. And that's good news. When it's colder and wetter, grass is going to grow and be very healthy. You're going to be mowing your lawn like crazy this year. So, things will grow for sure. Now, when grass is growing and vegetation is growing, it to some extent suppresses weeds. Ragweed likes hot, dry weather. So that tends to do very well in a hot, dry scenario. So if it's colder weather, we're just going to be washing out that ragweed pollen quite a bit. It won't be able to stay in the air for weeks on end. So that's the good news. We have the coolest in 6 years, above average rainfall, 9% wetter than last year, August, September, early October. So certainly some goods on a national scale. So chart right data here just says trees, we're going to be late February, March in the south, mid-April in the north. That's coming. Grass, middle April, early May, and late May and early June. Weeds, again, not as bad. If we look way out here beyond what he's even shown here, we are projecting a pretty brutally cold, snowy winter. This cycle will be nor'easters in the east, so the west, you've had your ton of snow. You may actually get a little more again next year, not as much as you've had this year. That could be another snowy winter for sure, where Andrea is in California. Not as severe as this year. The severe is probably going to shift more toward the Chicago and points east for snow and cold. So if you suffered poorly in December, Christmas time with that cold Arctic outbreak. And I do suffer from that piece. Cold bothers me a lot for my asthma. I just can't stand cold weather, hard to breathe. So that could be the case here, December, January, February. It's a long, intense winter ahead here for asthma sufferers. If we look here, if this is the middle spring period here, so I think we're showing you the, let's see, I'm trying to see what the dates are here on this. So these are just the spring weather trends. I want to say this is more focus here recently, so April through May timeframe. This is a high risk for suffering. So the chart left is just the temperature trends, 72.3. Forget the specific numbers. We just want to look at the trend. So the trend here for April is warmest in 11 years, below average, almost the driest since 2012. So again, this is a classic signature of something about as bad as 2012. You remember 2012? Again, that was kind of a dry allergy prone season. So again, be prepared. I think the next 2 weeks are going to be pretty severe. If we look at these trends here, now this is just showing you again the same weather maps, temperatures on the left, precip on the right. What we want to key in on here is this is for the regional areas. So then this is for the 1 April through 31 May period, so the next month or two. If you're in the yellow areas and the map left, orange areas, you're much warmer conditions. That's good trigger for allergy and asthma. If you're the map right, you want to look for those peaches and browns. That's dry. Again, more triggers. Again, so if you're in those areas that you see both. Now, if you're in an area like Texas, we do think, now I gotta be careful here. We think it's going to get wetter down there. We'll see. But Southwest could be cooler, wetter, and you've got tons of moisture and snow in those mountains, right? So again, this may act as a catalyst to maybe suppress a little bit of your allergy and asthma suffering in those bluer, greener, wetter areas in the Southwest. Northeast, again, cooler but drier. So you got part of the equation, right? Just dry is the key, right? If you're dry, you're keeping that. So the New York areas, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, we've got a much drier, much warmer season potentially here for us in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, Virginia. Down where Chris is in Tennessee, maybe a little wetter, so maybe not as bad. Florida, again, pretty dry. So again, those are areas where we'd be concerned about higher instances of allergy and asthma suffering. And we can look at these same trends on a global scale, right? So you may be traveling to Europe, you'd be okay maybe if you're in Germany, because it looks like it's going to be cooler and much wetter in Germany, so probably suppressing what pollen they have. But if you're headed to, probably not going to head to Russia, but if you were, Moscow, they're going to have a pretty bad season with warm, dry conditions. So just a way to look at that conditions. Down under in Australia, very dry here. They've had a really kind of cold, wet winter and summer. Now as they enter fall, pretty dry, so their seasons could be pretty bad. Now let's look at this. This is a busy chart here, but this is the way we look at data. This might be more for the big pharma companies out there that are trying to plan, but we're able to actually quantify the allergy and asthma and flu percent lift in sales week by week anywhere in the world. So in this case, again, we're just keying on that April period. We've got the US 6 degrees hotter and a precip index of 15, meaning it's drier, -15. Week ending April 22nd, 5 -28, a dry week. So any of these areas, these boxed black areas, these are where we think, you've got high incidence of allergy and asthma suffering. So we look here in the Northeast where we are. We've had a bad week here recently. Mid-April looks pretty bad again. So again, we've definitely got some suffering here. The good news is what you see as we get toward June, July, and August is that, it's not always that bad in those seasons. It can be. If you can stay hot and dry, you're just going to suspend all the pollutants. So keep in mind, also when you're hot and dry, not even when the allergy and pollen goes away, you're trapping pollutants, so versus if you're cold and wet with frequent cold fronts and a lot of stormy tornadoes, thunderstorms, right? You're just washing out and cleaning that air out a lot. So we believe that the air quality, if you will, in the July, August, September timeframe is probably going to be pretty good compared to the last few years. So that pollutant suffering may not be as bad. And then as we get to the ragweed season in August, September, early October, not much, right? I mean, again, it's going to be there. Ragweed will still grow. It's just not going to be able to be as prolific. Weeds like it hot and dry. If it's cold and wetter, it's going to be kind of choked out by other vegetation to some extent. So and again, like I said, you'll just be washing out that air and cleaning it out more frequently. So if we can get through the next 2 weeks here in April, a little bit in May, I think for most of us at least, we're home free for a not so bad back half of the season. And we'll just end here with Allergy Asthma. Again, we're very grateful for the partnership here. I know this is a very popular tool. So what we did here on the website, the very top of Allergy and Asthma Network, you can click your zip code and you can actually pick a date anywhere in the year ahead, about 10, 11 months ahead here right now. And if you're going to Hawaii, you may think, hey, I'm home free here in the East, but you don't know that when you're going to Hawaii in June, like, yikes, their allergy indexes are off the scale. So you may not be prepared for that when you're going on vacation, right? Oh, I'm out of the woods here in Florida, but I'm going up to Minneapolis. Well, yikes, you may not realize that you're about to go into an index of a 910 index of extreme suffering. And this is just, again, based on the years of analysis of point of sale. The other fun tools here, again, if you're, I always say, try to be savvy about how you monitor your ailments. Like, if you know that, hey, you're right, that day was 80 degrees and sunny and windy, and 3 days of that, and man, my allergies, asthma just went through the roof. Kind of keep a log. I know a lot of times doctors will recommend that to you. It's helpful. If you can just start to monitor your own triggers that are wet. Hey, the temperature was hot, it was dry, it was windy, right? What is your specific trigger that's doing that? Or versus it was rainy and wet, maybe you're finding that you got a mold type allergy, that due to mold and whatnot. So neat planning tool here. We have free apps, Weather Trends 360 Lite. It's free, it goes a year ahead. So if you know your specific triggers, this will tell you kind of, it's a great vacation planning tool, but can also maybe help you with, planning and being proactive with your suffering here. So Andrea, Chris, with that, I will stop here. Hope we answered maybe most of the questions, and we'll take any more from here.
Thank you, Captain Kirk. That's great information. And I think people initially, when they saw this webinar, they thought, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just weather. Well, just weather. This really impacts our health. This impacts our allergies. This impacts our allergy or asthma. So controlling our asthma means controlling our allergies. So this is vital information that they're sharing with us, how to protect our health coming up through spring and summer and throughout the year, actually. And one thing that I thought was really interesting when you talked about your year out forecast is, if there are people next summer that are planning weddings or city festivals or outdoor concerts, or even what you mentioned, European travel, we might want to know what we're going to be walking into as far as, making plans. Are we going to need canopies? Are we going to need an indoor venue in that place? So thank you for sharing the information about the year out forecast. I think that's really important. Let's take a look at some of the questions here. Captain Kirk, how can this data be presented to the public? In your opinion, what is the role of government in communicating climate crisis information?
Yeah, I mean, that's the job of the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Their job is to protect Chris today from tornadoes, because it could impact life and property, and Andrea from the avalanches and near-term weather. It's really been left up to some extent corporations, weather companies, the AccuWeather's of the world, IBM Weather Company, right, to try to help folks. So what we try to do, and again, I just wish there was more in this science of longer term. Again, NOAA does put out a year-ahead forecast. They're just not that great at it, right? There's so much more that could be done that's allowing you to be proactive, right? So we're helping Fortune 500 companies be proactive with their bottom line and how much money they're going to make on their sales. But right, Gates Foundation, for example, Bill Gates are doing a great trying to help people manage, diseases and whatnot. So I think there are organizations out there maybe that aren't pseudo government that could actually help, but they got to take it beyond the next week, right? I call that's reactive. You're reacting. You can't help really people plan. If you knew that you were going to have a horrible spring season, a horrible summer season, a horrible fall season, horrible winter season, right? The severity of that obviously could catch up with us. So I just think, if there was more companies, I'd love to have a little more competition in the long range space, predicting these outcomes. Right now, the best of the best, I think, is what you have on AAM. That indexes at least gives you some gauge, as to how bad, your allergy or asthma suffering might be based on where you're going.
Right. Excellent. Great information. Let's see. Another question we have is, what, if anything, are you able to observe regarding dampness or mold for allergies and health during wet cycles? I'm thinking of California and all the rain that they've received lately and all the flooding. Is it just drowned out by suppression of pollen and viruses that are worse in dry times?
I guess if I understand that correctly, again, yeah, there are people that suffer from mold, and certainly, you know, you can have it in your home. So when it's really humid, you know, wet summers, obviously, your house is going to be more humid. And naturally, it's more humid, obviously, in the wintertime than it is in the wintertime. Wintertime is very dry. But if you're, you know, especially if you live in the South, Florida's, you know, that it's humid all the time, right? You can get mold in your home more easily. But even here in the Northeast, California, for sure, anywhere can get those, you know, mold growing somewhere. It's less likely that would happen if it's hot and dry. You're just not going to grow as much mold spores. So, yeah, no, again, I think if you're in the Pacific Northwest, you know, where maybe you're California or even Utah now, where you've had a ton of rain and moisture, if that continues for a little bit here, yeah, that could be the trigger. So sometimes you don't always know, right? It's like, why am I sneezing my, it's what's causing this? You know, it's not the pollen, it's mold spores, it's something else. So again, that's why I always say kind of, you know, if you can, I know doctors highly recommend keeping a little log, you know, hey, why did I have this flare up? We did this research for migraine sufferers, right? It was the same thing. Like what I used to hear this funny story all the time about migraine sufferers is that, you know, it's pressure. Well, it's not, because if you think about it, barometric pressures was always kind of a thought that, you know, migraines were triggered by that. But if you go up a building that's, you know, even 50 stories high, or some people 20 stories high, the amount of pressure drop just going up a 20, 30, 40, 50 story building is more than you'll ever experience, you know, on a day-to-day basis at the surface. Right. So if you don't get a migraine going up to your office on the 30th floor of New York or 80th floor of New York, then it's not pressure, it's something else. So try to keep a log of it was wet, it was hot, it was 80, it was dry, it was windy, you know, figure out maybe what's causing your specific trigger.
I think that's a great idea. And oftentimes I have friends that are physicians and they said, hey, we're just like detectives and we need all of the clues to be able to figure out what's going on with you and how to help you. So like you say, write down as much information as you can. What were you doing at the time? Were you inside? Were you outside? What was the weather like? So great information. I love that. Let's see, we have another question here. What is the percentage of accuracy for the Weather 360 for 1 to 2 months ahead?
Okay, so that would be, let me see, I'll pull that slide up again. So the best way, I didn't show this chart, another chart here, but the accuracy of our app, so basically we do a daily year forecast, is typically the error rate. Now, again, where 80% of the people live near, if you live near New York City or San Francisco or Shanghai or Hong Kong, if you're near water, our error rate's about 1 or 2 degrees. You're hit, doesn't matter. So our forecast is just as accurate 2 months from now as it is 12 months from now, because it's the same process that goes into each one of those. And that's why we don't change it, because I have no way, the way we run our process, I have no way to change my April forecast. The only way I can change my April forecast is to do what everybody else does, and that's physics that goes out 2 weeks. So we do, when you're within the 2 week window, our forecast will be changing like everybody else's, you know, once or twice, 2-3 times a day, because there's new data in that 2 week window. Beyond that, there's nothing new to be able to change our forecast. Now, in the mid latitudes where a lot of us live, obviously, in the Midwest, our error rates can be between 3 and about 6 degrees a year ahead, right? So that's typically in the realm of a day 6 short range forecast. The industry average on a day 6 forecast, I have that chart. We just got the February audit from the IBMs, the Microsofts, AccuWeather, you know, Google's of the world. Google has the best weather these days, but we're losing out. We're second to Google in short range weather by a 1/10 of a degree. So we're very close. But on a day 6 forecast, you know, in February, there was 4 to 7 degree error. So again, our year ahead has less error than that forecast, even though it's a year ahead. And that's been proven out for the last 22 some years.
And that's impressive. Thank you. That's great information. You know, one of the things I was jotting down some notes about some of the things you were speaking of, and part of that is the wildfire forecast for California, which affects everyone. And I know at one time the wildfire smoke even went as far as the East Coast, and a lot of the schools in the Pacific Northwest have added air scrubbers to their schools to try to protect the children in the schools because of how bad the forest fires are in California. So knowing that, yes, then we may still have forest or fires in California, but there'll be more of the grass fires and not as much as, you know, burning a lot of timber. So if anything, that could be a little bit of ray of hope for people in California once they can dry out from all the flooding, I guess.
We saw all your smoke. So all the smoke that you guys had last year, and especially back in 2020, made it all the way to the east. It was a couple epic scenarios where it just got engulfed in the jet stream and the upper levels, and we had beautiful, gorgeous sunsets, but we couldn't see more than like a mile or two because of all the thick smoke, even here in Pennsylvania. So it went across the country. Another thing that can actually happen with dust, and again, it can be a trigger certainly for an asthma type scenario, is potentially every year the sub-Sahara Africa, so you're like, what's Africa got to do with our suffering? Well, you get a big Bermuda high pressure naturally in the Atlantic, you get those winds, if they're just right, they come off the Sahara Desert, which is just dusty sand, desert, but there's certainly gunk in there, their pollens and their sand and dust. That traverses the entire country. So it's been kind of unusual the last 2 years, again, in part because of the cycle we've been in, that allowed that to get all the way to the US. And so Texas, again, you may recall some of those days where it just got really thick, looked like smoke, but it was just suspended dust particles. Obviously, if you have any kind of breathing ailment, that was going to be, it made its way to the surface. So again, you got to watch that. This year's a little different. I think we're not going to see that scenario where the Saharan Africa dust comes off, like it has the last couple, 2-3 years. This year was definitely probably stay out in the Atlantic based on the patterns we're in right now. So we won't have to probably deal with that this year.
Excellent, excellent. And I love your information about fire season. And what people don't realize with asthma is it can be deadly. I have a son that ended up in ICU because of a wildfire, the smoke from a wildfire. So knowing this ahead of time and how to protect ourselves and to take cover, I think is so important. So this information really is invaluable. I had another thought as we were going along, and you were talking about when in the fall, when our homes, we turn on the heat and home dries out, our noses are allowing the viruses in. So for some of the areas that use central air or the forced air for air conditioning, is that the same sort of thing? Would that also dry out the air and dry out the nose and allow more viruses, even in summer and even in spring or summer?
So whatever, again, typically the way HVAC tends to work. So in the summertime, you just naturally have very high humidity, not obviously in your area of the world in the West, but east of the Rockies, we have humidity, right? So there's your heat pumps, whatever your central air type air conditioning is going to do. The first thing it's got to do is take the moisture out of the air, tries to take out the humidity, right? And then after it does that, it'll try to cool your house is the goal. So you don't usually have a problem with low humidity in the, really anywhere, even the desert Southwest. They get the Southwest monsoon, so they got the swamp coolers, right? So you tend to have moisture in the air in the summertime. It's just in the fall, winter. As soon as you turn on your heat pump for your heat, no matter what you're doing, your fireplace, wood stove, doesn't matter. Whatever you're doing to put heat in your home, you're going to dry out that house at warp speed. And if you've ever put a humidifier or hygrometer, right, to see exactly how dry your air is, you will be shocked. It's static electricity, right? You touch a doorknob and you get zapped. I guarantee you, your humidity is south of 20%. That is too dry. That same Harvard rat study showed that when they put rats next to each other that had the flu virus, if it was above, I think about 68 degrees, so warmer, and it was 43% or higher humidity in that cage, even though those mouse were all infected with the flu virus, they didn't spread it. And in part because the virus didn't have the longevity that it did in the humid environment, right? And it was warmer, right? So the virus may have died instantly. Whereas flu virus in a cold, wet, or cold, dry environment outside your doorknobs, your golf carts, your gas station pumps, the grocery store carts, right? That cold virus in a cold, dry environment, that flu virus could last there for 2 days. You touch it, you touch your eye, you just got the flu, right? Versus in a humid environment, even in your home, it can't, it's not just going to be as viable, if anything. So I always keep my house. I have a humidifier. A, it's good for my lungs. I don't like dry air. So if you keep your house around 43%, Harvard will love you because of the less flu issues and disease, even COVID. We said this almost week 3 of COVID, that it's a spike type, virus. It's probably going to act just like flu does or pollen or anything else, right? It keeps its integrity in a nice, dry environment, right? Dryish, low humidity environment. If it swells, it's less viable. So anyway, I keep your house humid if you can. I think it's better to keep it humid than too dry.
Interesting. Once again, this is information that, as we're putting the pieces together, thinking how this is really affecting our health. So absolutely, if you have a dry home, talk to your doctor if he thinks you need a humidifier. I know my allergist was very, very specific that if we were going to use a humidifier, that we needed to keep it very, very, very clean
Oh, yeah.
and change it. Right.
I changed my filter, it's a big one. It does about, I don't know, 3,000 square foot area, but change the filter every month, however they say. There's
Yes.
little chemicals to put in it to keep the mold from growing on it, but then you're good.
Yes.
So do
Great.
that.
Great thing. Isn't it just interesting how all these things impact us? This is just fascinating to me. I'm a little bit of a science nerd. We have someone in the chat that said they are experiencing the dust. They're down in Texas. So kind of what you're talking about with the dust that kind of goes around the world, depending on if there's a drought over somewhere else in the Middle East. Well, guess what? We might get their dust.
You have some hope in Texas. I don't know if there's an area that could remain dry. It might be more central South Texas that until the hurricanes hit, unfortunately. So that's one area where I don't know. I think the Kansas drought's can improve, but Texas might not. We'll have to see here. So that one area, if it stays dry, you're gonna have pollen, you're gonna have all that good stuff. So it may not be the best. I guess if I had to pick a bad spot, I might say it's gonna be Texas. So.
Okay. And actually, speaking of dust, one of the things when I was in Arizona, I had just missed a dust storm. I think they call them the haboob. And it had rolled in just after I left. So is that something that you can find out ahead of time if something like that's going to hit? Once again, if you're planning an outdoor wedding or you're at a baseball game or something, it'd be great to have a heads up that was rolling in.
It's just a fun. Those are going to be micro scale events, right? I mean,
okay.
Santa Ana winds that can happen under certain weather, high Bermuda high or high pressure systems, in Santa Ana get these crazy winds that go through the canyons. So those could be just like localized events. If you're going to be colder and wetter, you're in the Southwest region, right? You're more likely to get a lot of monsoon thunderstorms when that kicks in more toward June timeframe. So if you're going to get more wet and more thunderstorms, you're probably going to be more worried about flash flooding in those areas rather than big dust storms. So typically more of the hot dry scenario.
Okay.
And then if you got some kind of wind event, you would suspend it. Wet desert sand is probably a little less suspending in the air than hot dry season.
Right. And along with that, with the thunderstorms, if you're visiting any of the national parks, you're going through some of these slot canyons. We've already had drownings here in Utah because storms from 20 miles away can make it down through these canyons. So knowing that ahead of time also could be really vital.
And the snow melt's going to be epic, right? I mean, you've got 800 mountains. I know some of the California mountains have 1,000 inches of snow. In fact, it probably won't melt will be the theme, right? A lot of it will melt, but you're going to have a ton of snow all summer long in those mountains. Yes,
it's going to be interesting. They're already getting sandbags ready. Let's see, there's in the chat, someone's asking, what app can you use to see this forecast?
Okay, to see the consumer-friendly version, you can go to our website. If you go to our website, weathertrends360.com, there you go into the alerts section, and I believe this is still freely available. So if you go to the weathertrends360.com and then you find the little alerts, there's this little vacation planner. We're going to try to pull it out of that buried area, but it's a neat tool. You can go in and pick any zip code anywhere in the world. You pick your ideal weather from 20 to 90 degrees. You want sunny or you want storms, you want snow, you want rain, you want whatever, right? You pick what you want. And then when you click go, it'll tell you the earliest for those conditions, the best week for those conditions, and the second best week for those conditions in the year ahead. So it's a neat planning tool. If you know exactly what weather you want, right? I want to go to Disney World in Florida and it better be 80 and sunny. I don't want thunderstorms. So it's really, that's our strength, is predicting an event like that. The other thing is just WT360 Lite. It's free app in the app stores, iPhone and Android. So again, it's a neat tool. It's got a little slidey bar, goes all the way out of your head. So again, it's a great planning tool for vacation, but if you know your triggers for certain things that, hey, for me, as soon as it's below like 32 degrees, I have a hard time breathing outside. So I know if it's below 32, it's time to, think about, stay inside more, get my humidifier in my office. So again, these two sites will probably help a bit.
Perfect. Thank you. And we have time for probably just two more questions. Someone asks, how can we mitigate the expected effects of big weather events?
Well, again, that's a hard question, right? So again, we can't even tell you where the next major hurricane is going to hit. We can tell you we're in a cycle that suggests that we've got another very active year this year. There's high risk. Florida, Texas, East Texas might be our Texas and Florida and maybe North Carolina, those are kind of our real primary areas, say, versus Alabama. We're not as worried about Alabama as we would be, the other areas. It's just always be prepared, right? I mean, again, my aunt will tell you from Florida, once you've gone through something cataclysmic like that. I went through Hurricane Floyd here in the East in 1999 and had no power for 12 days. We went through Sandy with no power for a week. You only have to go through that once before you say, you know what, I probably should invest in a generator. I probably should at least have an emergency generator to keep, a small refrigerator cold for my medications, whatever, right? I mean, so have some, I'm very much a planner, right? I mean, I've got a family, young daughter, right? So you want to take care of them. Just have some kind of emergency plan for just think about the things that impact your area. Chris has got tornadoes. We have tornadoes here, but not as many as she does, right? So have a plan. What am I going to do? Yikes, my daughter's in school and I'm here. How am I going to handle that if I got to do something, right? I mean, just have kind of a plan. Plan is better than no plan.
I was thinking the same thing. You see something like this happen, and then they'll show on the news that everybody hits the grocery store and the shelves are empty. So planning ahead and having bottled water and having batteries and having whatever snacks on hand or whatever else you need in addition to the generator could be really helpful, because you're going to go to the grocery store and the shelves are going to be empty. Yeah. So let's see. Our last question on here, and this was probably back when we were talking about the humidity in the home. Someone asks, would nasal saline solution help retain moisture?
I'm a proponent. I have a crazy eccentric doctor. He's got about 300 patents on different things. He was an engineer, Russian engineer, and he's really huge on. So when I had COVID many times, several times actually, the way he got me through it was actually a saline solution. There was George Washington research that showed that salt, and again, this is sort of just sometimes common sense is a better, strategy than, all the other crazy stuff you could do. Salt in nasal spray, I forget only one company that really makes a sterile saline shot, solution up your nose, and then gargling salt water. It kills viruses. It kills that. It won't allow the replication in theory, right? So he was a huge proponent when I had COVID to do the nasal saline solution, drink salt gargled water. It was he had all kinds of strategy, and again, there was backed up by research from George Washington, big schools that academic institutions that showed that this does work. But how many people even knew that was an opportunity to fight COVID and get over it more quickly? He got the first time I suffered through it about 3 weeks. It's pretty bad flu-like symptoms. The second time I had it for about 3 days. And he banged it out. It was the Omicron and the Delta or whatever, right? I know I had both of those last winter, but in any event, that can work. It definitely, you gotta be careful. You can't use it all the time. It's something you'd use in a short-term environment, but you wouldn't want to use salines. I'm not a doctor, but again, he would not probably recommend using that more than a week or two, consistently.
Right. And that's one of those old school things I learned from my grandpa growing up, is if I had a sore throat, gargled with salt water, and it took care of it. So sometimes some of these old school charms really do work. So thank you, Captain Kirk. I could keep you on the line for hours because I've learned so much from you. And for those of you that are on the line, we are going to have a survey. Please feel free to put information in there. I do look at every single suggestion that comes up on the evaluation survey. And I use that to plan the next webinars that are coming your way. So if there's information you want that we haven't covered, or we need to expand in an area, please let me know. And Captain Kirk, if you can just go forward one more slide. Thank you. So this will be our next webinar. This is April 18th, Smart Therapy, Making a Science-Based Choice. And this is a way of treating asthma where you use a single inhaler for your rescue and for your maintenance. We'll talk more about that. This webinar, Smart Therapy, will be available for continuing education credits. So if you need that, definitely sign up for that one. And thank you again, Captain Kirk. Any farewell, any last things you want to say before we hop off?
Well, be proactive. Don't be reactive. Go out there and be proactive with all this stuff, right? Medication, weather, stay on top of it.
That's what I'm thinking too. They tell you start on your allergy medicine before you start sneezing and wheezing. And that's why this presentation has been so important. Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.